Just want to kind of provide a little more context on who we are at Farallon Strategies. We were started by a man named Michael McCormick. Some of you may have run across him. I'm not going to get too California-centric here, but he's had a good impact in California. He was in the Brown administration for 6 years, did a lot of work on the adaptation planning guide, the general plan guidelines, also spent a year in the Obama administration working at CEQ on the Resilience AmeriCorps program. He's been around a long time, and he was out in the world after the Brown administration, working in private practice and seeing that the same old strategies for being a consultant and supporting communities were really not the way he wanted to run a company. So he launched Farallon Strategies. It's actually named after his daughter. And it was really designed to be a partner and a collaborator with the communities we work with. We're a B Corp, which means we're trying to do things a little differently in our DNA. We're a small team. We all work part-time because we believe in living a life while working. And we're doing a lot of really interesting work across the board. I had the opportunity to join about a year and change ago to work on this national service space. I've had this incredibly bizarre and sort of serendipitous opportunity to work at the intersection of climate change and national service. I didn't even know what AmeriCorps was when I got into this work. I was like, there's young people, they want to do climate plans, they want to be getting involved. This is a thing that could help them do that. I was thinking about it from the climate side. And so we built up these programs. I worked first on something called Climate Corps Bay Area. Then I launched Civic Spark with what was called the Local Government Commission and ran that for 7 years, growing it up to about 100 people a year. And then I had a year, I will call it a adventure with the governor's office, helping start the California Climate Action Corps. And then I decided to step out and work in private practice. And currently I'm working with Washington, North Carolina. I've worked with the National Network of America's Service Commissions. It's sort of the professional association of folks who administer AmeriCorps funding. Worked with, Michigan. I'm drawing a blank at the moment. So I've really been around this space, and I'm going to try and bring some of that to the conversation. So I'm going to provide a little context. I'm going to talk about an overview of what I think of as climate service, this large bucket area, offer some summary thoughts, and we'll have a discussion. I put way more content in these slides than I want to get into on the call today, but I wanted to leave behind some tables of information we put together so you all can digest that on your own time. So we'll obviously be sharing these slides out with you. So a little bit of national service history. Y'all, I think, had a presentation on AmeriCorps at one point. I'm just going to say a couple of things here. National service has been around for a long time. VISTA, which many of you have heard of, has been around since the 60s. It was a Lyndon Johnson program. AmeriCorps conservation corps were started in the New Deal under FDR. AmeriCorps was launched by Bill Clinton in the 90s. They're all kind of one big umbrella now. Conservation corps are independent organizations, often with AmeriCorps. I won't get into the sort of funding streams today. They're sort of commingled. They're broadly what we call national service programs. Since the generation, these programs have worked on environmental issues, as Braden touched on: conservation, restoration, energy efficiency, environmental education. The challenge has been that they're kind of ad hoc, that they're running however they ran, whenever they were running it, and they're scrappy organizations, they perennially underfunded. And so the connection with the larger climate work and the connection with state goals is often quite lagging. And because they've been underfunded, they also struggle with issues around administration, funding, and equity, which are increasingly going to be challenging if you're trying to run a broad-based climate-focused service program. So, as I think you guys maybe heard in a previous conversation, the Biden administration tried to do it. They put a climate corps, a civilian climate corps, in the original executive order. It got picked up by the House at the scale of $15 billion, which, to give you a little bit of context, if you don't know this, the entire AmeriCorps budget is about $1 billion. This was going to not only fund a national civilian climate corps on its own, it was going to raise the living allowance for every AmeriCorps member nationally, over 75,000 people, per year, to $15 an hour, which would have been a game changer for national service in this country. Did not happen, as you all know, But the momentum from that work, the conversations, the ideation, the enthusiasm really have carried forward. And that's bringing us into this conversation today and some other ones. So a little bit about climate service. This will be no surprise to all of you working at the forefront of local leadership around climate action. What happens at the state level can't happen without local leadership. Tribal, local government, community groups have to be active players. But this gap in capacity, the people power gap, is profound. We're seeing it actually happen with IRA, like DOE and everybody else is like, okay, now we have the money. How can we actually get it to play? There aren't enough bodies in DC or out in the field to take up that work in many cases. One of the particular areas of gap that we see a lot of is in that touch point to the community. I have never met a local government who doesn't want to do more community engagement, would not like to be out in the community more, building relationships, listening and hearing, because that's how you actually build a plan that has the ownership and buy-in of the community, but it's almost impossible. So that's where climate service comes in. This is where these programs can come in. In my vision, climate service programs are an extension of the will of the community to get in the fight together. It's an empowerment strategy. It's an organizing strategy. Sure, you can get specific things done like energy efficiency weatherization projects, restoration projects, but in my mind, it's more of a catalytic force. It's a way to help bring about citizen engagement, empowerment, and action. I talked to a woman in North Carolina whose community has been devastated by hurricanes and flooding. And what she said after she had a whole set of services from these AmeriCorps members was, yeah, it's about the flooding, but it's also about the engagement with flooding that now my community has. Because we got to the table, we had these people there, and people got more activated. And that to me is really what climate service can be about. So a couple of things just to contextualize that. We're trying to leverage service, community service activities in a structured way. I'm sure many of you have had interns before. It's hit or miss. Sometimes it's amazing. It's a lot of work. Having a structured service program that taps generally emerging talent with an activity under an umbrella, that's what these programs are intended to do. They create a frame and an infrastructure to move interest, passion, and action into delivery of service, hopefully at the community level. Might be AmeriCorps, might be conservation corps, there's fellowship programs, there's structured internship programs. I'm not an advocate for any one or the other. I'm most familiar with AmeriCorps, but there are models out here. Key to it is that it's structured, that it's not just a one-off, I got to go find some awesome grad student this year, but there's a mechanism there. You can have a lot of different activities in these programs. It might be what we call direct action, which is really like boots on the ground, restoration, urban, tree planting, heavy lifting kind of work. It might be community education and engagement, or it might be where I've spent most of my career around capacity building, helping with policy and planning development, assessment work, really sitting side by side with the sustainability coordinators, doing whatever technical work needs to be done to unlock the work. Generally, you're going to want to see them in an ideal world nested within and supporting larger climate goals. And this is one of the gaps in the field that we've seen over and over again, is like you have a great conservation corps, and yes, nominally it's climate focused, but they don't even know what the state climate goal is. They're just kind of like, yeah, more tree planting, that's good. More restoration work, that's good. More environmental ed, that's good. But they don't actually know what the context is. And this is increasingly important to do. So I did some work last year, now it's a year and a half ago, with America's Service Commission. When the Civilian Climate Corps came out, one of the things that happened was everybody loved it. Everybody said, this is great. Nobody could tell you what it was going to look like, because what they hadn't done was look at market demand. What do organizations want and need from a Civilian Climate Corps? Do they all want energy efficiency weatherization? Do they all want restoration projects? What is it that they need? There was nothing. We tried to do some survey work to try and get at that question. We asked about things like, what do you want help with? And what roles would people play? And that's what you can see here. I'm not going to go through it. The takeaways for me really were, people want a lot of different things. There is no one climate corps out there. There's a lot of climate corps to be had based on who you are as a local government, nonprofit, tribal community, what you want to do, what your issues are. So we can't create like a top-down climate core is this approach from DC. We need to let communities decide. There's also, in terms of roles, there's a lot of different needs. Your traditional direct implementation was the top item, but the next three items are really engagement and education. That was actually, you bundle those together, that's what people want the most of. They need help talking to and with their communities. Then that sort of capacity building stuff is also pretty significant when you come at it. We also asked about program values. What do people in the field, you all, what do you want to see this program put as the top values that these programs will deliver? And we were kind of surprised because, frankly, I think people are generally self-interested, but what they put at the top were member benefits, member experience. If we're going to create a civilian climate corps, we want it to be good for the people who serve. And full stop, that was the top three items there in terms of pathways. And the next down was that the communities have a voice in what happens. So again, we're trying to create a thing, a climate corps, but it's going to be made up of thousands and thousands of different things. And that's actually really challenging. And it's one of the areas that we struggle with in this work a lot. How do you have a recognizable identity of a program while still allowing communities and people to serve the way they need to serve best? I'm going to go into a little bit of a case study example quickly of the program I ran for about 7 years, CivicSpark. I happen to know it best, so it's kind of closer to my awareness. It's just one program, but I think it's illustrative. So CivicSpark was created to actually serve local governments, principally. They branched out into nonprofits and others, but they were with the local government commission, so that was the focus area. And they knew that local governments needed help, so they created it around this capacity building lens. Originally, it was going to be like a climate mitigation focused program. Jerry Brown and Ken Alex and in his administration were super focused on mitigation. And then they saw how the program was working, and we had a drought in California. And they said, well, could you do a drought program? What about water? Could we add water? And we're like, well, local government's needs around capacity building are really more of a Swiss Army knife situation. They need planning support, policy support, engagement support. It doesn't really matter if it's water or climate mitigation. So sure, let's add water. And then they were like, we got this housing crisis. Broadband, that's an issue. And it just became this like unfolding flower of opportunity, because the truth was, again, back to the slides I shared, people need a lot of different things, but they need that people power. And we had created a dynamic setup. It was hard to run for it because we couldn't be experts in all these fields. But by the time I left, we had done hundreds of projects in everything you guys all work on: greenhouse gas inventories, regional EV assessments, carbon farming pilots, done a ton in adaptation as that became more pressing, fire recovery planning, sea level rise studies, urban heat assessments. And then more and more this equity lens was being layered on to everything that we were doing as it became a bigger part of the climate conversation: community engagement, community need assessment, leadership development. So the program really serves, in my mind, as a proxy for this climate service space overall, which we really had to maintain flexibility to meet people where they are and evolve with the needs over time. I'll leave this with you guys, but it's had an impact in California, really both in terms of the project work getting done and the leadership development. I like to share this little anecdote, which is there's a woman who now works in the governor's office, a strategic growth council in California. So, she's a policy and planning person. She was in like the 16, 17 class, had a couple jobs in between there. I ran into her not so long ago and had an email exchange, and she lists her CivicSpark class in her professional email, because in California, it's now seen as a cohort and identity and a badge of success. And that's like, you would want that everywhere, right? You would want people to recognize the Arizona Climate Corps people as change makers. And that to me is a marker of success. A couple other leadership stories I've gotten here. Zach was with the city of Pleasanton, and his job was to assess whether they join a community choice aggregation in the Bay Area. I saw somebody in the group is working on that. He did the policy memo for the city that ultimately led to their adoption, and then he got offered a job. Like win, 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 right? Citizens get more clean energy, city gets a talented person, Zach gets to jumpstart his career. Nikki as well did a Blue Restaurant program. I don't know if you have something like that, but it's like a water conservation program for restaurants. She's did the certifications, identified a ton of savings, and then moved on to another city as a water specialist. So we see that kind of stuff over and over again. And that's what we want to see. We want to see people opening up their opportunity, creating success, and moving into, leadership, and then continuing to support the work going on, because it's never going to end with one project. So now moving to like what's happening nationally and the stateside stuff, and I hope I'm moving quick enough for our time frame. I think I am. But given what happened with the Climate Corps nationally and the fact that it didn't happen, many states started moving on their own plans, exploring what they could do, looking for opportunities, whether led internally within the AmeriCorps National Service Space or led by legislators. This map is probably incomplete at this point because I don't know everything going on at all states. But it does show you a number of the places where this is going on. And I've broken it up into programs that I consider underway, where they've made some commitment and are at some level of action on this. Programs that are still developing, Oregon got some legislative direction, still trying to figure out how it's going to launch. Louisiana actually has it in their climate action plan, but politics there. North Carolina, we're helping ideate a design concept there. And then there's a couple that I listed, Hawaii and New York, that have interesting programs, but they're not really run in the traditional national service space. New York is running a fellowship, a climate justice fellowship out of their Energy Research Authority. So there's stuff happening. Where I'm focused on, and to Braden's point, if you were to look at where environmental programs are happening in the national service space in the country, it would be every state. It is happening everywhere, right? Whether it's a Conservation Corps fellow, it's just university programs. These are programs where states are coming together to create some form of state level initiative. It's got connection to state government. It's being run across the state with some connection to state goals. And generally, it's maybe leveraging additional investments at a statewide level. And I think this is important because, back to my point about what climate service is, we want to see these things serving a larger whole than just being individual program activities. So this is where I focus on. California has probably the biggest program going on. It was Governor Newsom actually made the person who runs AmeriCorps programming in California a cabinet member, which was novel. So he's got that connection. The governor made some pretty big commitments to service, and then they put money on the table from legislators. So they're running, I think they're going to be up to 300 people this coming year in their Climate Action Corps. And then I would say Maine and Minnesota are probably the further along in that kind of launch point. Michigan is partnered with their climate office and should be launching this fall. Colorado launched about a year ago. Washington has a bill that is looking very likely to go forward this session. So some really cool stuff happening. So I'll just touch briefly on what a couple of these look like, so you have a sense of the flavor, and then I'm going to get into some more breakdown of that. So I mentioned California kind of went big in this space. What they've decided to do is really focus on the idea of climate service members as community organizers. So the primary activity that they're engaged in from a service program perspective is volunteer mobilization. They thought, you know what, we really want to have people out there getting people involved. So they have 3 subject focuses. They're focused on urban greening, food waste diversion, and wildfire prevention, but they're doing it through community engagement events. They're hosting regional climate action days. They are having the members organize volunteer events. They're trying to connect it up with behavior change, education. I think at the moment, because California has a big food waste diversion law that passed recently, they're literally going door to door with composting information in their communities. They're based with nonprofits and local governments, but that's their job, this organizer role. In Maine, they got initially they did a study, they got funding to do a study, they got a staff person on board. So they don't have a lot to work with there, but they have created what we're calling an umbrella. So they're funding a little bit of a program here and there. They have a bill pending right now that would give them, I think, $2 million to seed some more program activities. they have a wide range of issue areas they want to focus on: coastal zone prevention, transportation, energy, housing, public education. And they're trying to support both existing programs and the emergence of some new programs. So they should have, sort of roughly 50 people under the banner come this year. The Michigan Climate Corps is connected to Michigan's new Healthy Climate Action Plan, the My Healthy Climate Action Plan. So the state office is going to be funding a specific Civic Spark-like capacity building planning program of about 30 members, but also providing grants to other programs to be involved, and then providing some overall network coordination. They have an annual climate conference, and they want to bring all the climate service members there. Minnesota is working really closely with one program operator, and they've so far got 3 initiatives underway: a community forestry, an energy program, and then this kind of sustainability advisor type role. They're going through some transformation, trying to figure out how do we package that stuff. They have some really smart people there who care about evidence base and evidence-based practices. And so they're trying to figure out how do we do a lot of things, but still have it all button up and be demonstrably impactful. So that's kind of a little flavor of what's happening out there. What that does in my world, I'm big on structure. I have a flawed architectural background, so I turn everything into some sort of structure. So I really see 2 prevalent approaches for a statewide initiative. Either you go with the flagship model, which is what California did. We're going to throw most of our eggs and resources behind one program that we have more direct control over and can serve sort of a cohesive vision in the community and represent that kind of vision of the governor's office for what climate service should look like. You'll see some pros and cons on here. I'm not going to go through them. I just want you to have this for reference. The other approach is what we call the network or umbrella approach, like Maine is taking, which is we're going to set the table, but we're not going to prescribe everybody who's in or out, and we're going to try and lift up the resources we have. Frankly, some of that comes from what money you have and how much political capital you have behind it, right? If you've got the ability to fund one thing at scale, maybe you go that route. A lot of these states are pretty scrappy. Colorado's got a staff person, and they're like, yes, we'll hold the table, we'll set the table because that's all we got right now. But I think there's some really practical reasons to go that way as well. Braden touched on, there's a lot out there that's already happening. Why reinvent the wheel? Why not serve communities with the resources and infrastructure that's already there? So those are the kind of 2 dominant flavors that we're seeing of a statewide initiative. They both definitely have pros and cons. It's not easy to do this either way you go. And I cannot say with certainty there's an absolute value to one or the other. What I will say for California is they're getting a lot of press. Having the cabinet level appointment for visibility and events makes a difference. That lifts the whole world up, but they're also displacing existing programs, and there's challenges with that. So enough said on that one. So what does this sort of look like as we look to think about your next steps, your ideas, and how you might move forward on this? So the first thing I'll say is there's a landscape of opportunity out there, right? There is existing programs, there's existing needs, and service programs can be brought together and brought to bear to help in this area. This is another table I created for a project that I was working on. It was actually in North Carolina. It was a little more specific to them, and so I've generalized it here. But we did a ton of survey and conversations and some focus groups there. And what came out of that is there's really 3 main dimensions of activity and 3 sort of locus of action, right? And all of them could have a service component depending on your needs and your opportunities. So you could go with the kind of analytic support that I described under Civic Spark. Maybe it's going to happen by placing somebody in a community at a local government level. But states need that capacity support too. They're woefully bad, most cases that I've seen. I don't want to cast aspersions on any Arizona state folks here, but most state folks are also struggling from an inability to get the word out, help bring and connect the dots between what's in the field and their own needs, and they could use help. Similarly, your councils of government, your regional entities, they also need analytic support to do that. But those locus of activity also happens for education and implementation. So I was talking to actually a public health officer, in North Carolina, and they're like, oh my God, if we could only have regional agents getting the word out about some of our heat risk and hurricane risk, that would be fantastic, right? So that's a state-focused educational program. Similarly, having a, working in K-12 districts in a single community on climate education could matter. Implementation can be done at all those levels. So there's really a matrix here to be considered for your needs, and how do you button those things up. I put at the bottom this coordination function, because that's also what makes it a statewide initiative. All these programs that are out there and new programs that might come online will flounder in the face of the challenges we face unless we can sort of coordinate what's happening and tell a larger story. And usually that's going to be the commission or the operating agency who's kind of pushing the climate core in their state. But there's super common elements here, and this gets back to the values I touched on. Participant benefits. How do we raise the floor for everybody participating in these programs so that we are getting a more diverse cohort participating? The leadership opportunities are open. This can reflect all of our communities, particularly our most underserved communities or under-resourced communities who are often left out. Also reducing the cost for those communities to participate, right? Like having the most affluent communities getting affluent service members to work on their climate plans is a miss in my book. So you got to crack that nut financially. Dealing with recruitment through and training and common reporting, so this does tell a larger story. Those are all those coordination functions that matter. When it comes to resourcing this, there's kind of, in my mind, a dominant vision. You could see it happening a variety of ways, but you need money. I just will not, there's no way to do this on the cheap. AmeriCorps is already underfunded. There needs to be money put on the table from legislators, philanthropic sources, or ideally the federal government issues some executive orders for some of this IRA money or something and starts unlocking this. But you're going to need an investment, right? And then typically that's going to go to a lead organization. It could be the commission. That's what we call the AmeriCorps grantors. They're sort of well set up to do this, who are going to do two things. They're going to spend money on coordination, and they're going to provide resources to the programs, whether new or existing programs. They're going to help lift those guys up, but also they're going to demand that they report on common platforms, that they share results, that they're sort of opening up so that whole starts to get seen. So that's kind of the structural side of how you might envision going forward. And that's what's happening in, say, Washington. They have, Governor Inslee was like one of the first promoters of a climate corps before the Biden administration put it out. It was in his platform when he was running for president, but then he kind of dropped the ball in Washington, frankly. But now that it kind of got kicked down the curb in DC, he came back to his team and said, we want to have a climate corps here. He went to his commission, he's working with them, there's a bill running, and it looks like this. Some money that gets distributed to Serve Washington, that's the commission, and they're doing a set of activities that will sort of flow like this to stimulate the work. There's some help out there for this work. It's not happening in a vacuum, even though it's disaggregated. Would definitely recommend that some of you, if this is of interest, sign up for the Partnership for the Civilian Climate Corps. It's basically a network made up of Service Year Alliance, America's Service Commission, and the Core Networks. They're the three big players in the service world, and then a lot of affiliated organizations, some local commissions, some local service programs, but we've also got folks like Evergreen, U.S. Climate Alliance has joined. They're propagating advocacy resources, examples. It's, in terms of joining something, it's the lowest lift you can imagine. You don't actually have to do anything, but you're then in the flow of information. Certainly you can get more involved. We've created a couple of public things. These links will be available to you. There's these profiles of the states that I outlined that I've been maintaining. You can go look at them and start to say, hey, what does this look like? There's a database that I've built. It's got about 200 things in it. Originally, it was mostly for the AmeriCorps folks, so it's got things like U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, stuff that's bread and butter for you all is novel to them, but there's also legislative examples and models of programs that could be useful to folks like you. And then we're working on a toolkit. We have some funding to pull it all together in a more collated way. So the last thought before we turn to discussion is that climate service as a concept at a statewide level is a really ripe opportunity. It was still among the most popular of Biden's proposals, even though it didn't get funded. There's been some polling. People want to do something, and giving them a way to do it is really great. But there's challenges. Money's going to flow, but how do we get access to it is a question. Service needs to kind of get better at coming to the climate table, which is frankly what I'm doing here with you today, is like trying to come into your world and say, think about service. There are some guideposts out there, but there's also some cautionary notes about design. There's a lot of politics in this stuff. You know, we've seen it in Washington, we've seen it in North Carolina. When you start talking about this stuff, everybody's got a little bit of flavor that they want to throw in, and they may not understand how these things work. So with that, open it up for discussion.